So yeah, presenting today for our kickoff meeting for the building's flood assessment for Kansas is Will Lehman from Institute for Water Resources. And here, let you go ahead and take over, Will.
All right, you guys can see my screen? All right, so hi, I'm Will, like Brian said, and I'll try to go through this pretty quick. I got a few slides. I want to talk about a couple of topics just to make sure we're all on the same page. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. You know, when it comes to floodplain management right now, our current state is that we operate to a line. The federal minimum standard is the SFHA, which is about the 100-year floodplain. So we have this polyline and we're kind of left to figure out the rest, I'd say. You know, you can look to see what structures are inside or whatever. You can make, there are rules about what development might go on in order to be a participating partner so that you can get NFIP participation. You know, there's rules about that are useful, but that doesn't necessarily solve all our problems when it comes to floodplain management. So I think one improvement, a slight improvement, might be to be able to integrate some sort of structure source. You know, an improvement might be to add a structure inventory. So there's a lot of different inventories that are out there. You could use state level or county level parcel data. You could use Bing footprints. You could use USA Structures, which is a federally provided footprint data source based off of aerial imagery and some limited LiDAR analysis. Like I said, you could use parcel data, or you could use something like the National Structure Inventory, and none of these products by themselves are perfect. So you kind of have to grapple with them collectively to some degree. Of course, that by itself still really isn't much. I would know, say for instance, that this structure right up here, it's present in the structure database that I'm using here. I know that it is inside of the green polygon that represents the SFHA, but that's about all I know. I don't know what kind of structure it is necessarily, depending upon my data source. So if it's Bing footprints, I just know the footprints there. If it's parcel data, I might know where its parcel is, but I might not know without further analysis where its location is specifically. And with USA Structures, I might have a damage category, but I don't necessarily have a value. NSI tries to bring all that together so that we can have a little bit better picture at our starting level, but because of the scale of the National Structure Inventory, it's not necessarily accurate everywhere for every attribute. So there are problems with the attribution. If our objective is to have an improved understanding of flood risk throughout the state so that we can do the activity of floodplain management better, we need to think a little bit more about how we intersect those, some sort of structure inventory with some sort of hazard. So more than just the 100-year. Right here, I have a proposal to calculate the expected annual damage or average annualized loss for every structure that would be exposed to the flood depths from some sort of gridded data set throughout the state or throughout our study region. You can see here a picture of that, and right off the bat, you see, you know, darker red might be, in this case, darker red is larger expected annual damage, and then lighter red is less significant expected annual damage. I've added the 100 or 1,000 year depth grid to show kind of why there are structures that are getting flooded, you know, out in this fringe. And I wanted to then also add the 100-year SFHA to show that there is obviously some damages that are outside of the 100-year. If we zoom in, you can see a little bit more granular picture that there are structures that are flooded outside of the 100-year. This is, again, the 1,000-year. I didn't plot the 500 or the 200, but presumably you could do that and you can figure a little bit more out about the specific frequencies. But the reason I bring this up is if I'm floodplain managing only to the SFHA, I might be misprioritizing my work. On the one hand, I might be missing structures that are outside, beyond the SFHA. But on the other hand, I also might be missing opportunities to isolate my limited resources to those structures that are being flooded more frequently than the 100 year. Within that green polygon of the 100 year, not all structures are flooded at the same recurrence rate. Some of them are flooded more frequently. Here with this, I don't know, I'll call it salmon, this salmon colored line, we have the 5-year floodplain. So these structures that are present right here and here, we would say they're getting flooded at a more frequent level than the structures that are between the 5-year and the 100-year. And those are probably contributing a significant portion of the recurring losses. Now, I would have to think about the significance of the loss to know if it's the largest contributor to our expected damages, but it allows me to think more specifically about my activities that I might do within my floodplain at different frequencies. So I have here a little statement of risk to make sure that we're all on the same page. When I talk about risk, it's a combination of the hazard, the thing that's causing damage, the thing that's making that pathway to cause damage. What that would include is also how likely that hazard is to occur. So the SFHA is flooding. We don't know how significant of flooding, but we know that it occurs at the 100 year. So I need something that's more specific. I need to know how significant and how frequent. And so that would be what we're trying to do with our hazard side. If there are levees in the picture, we would want to think about performance. I'm not necessarily suggesting that for this effort. But then also with consequences, we need to know where the assets are and what the significance of their exposure is and their vulnerability. So we would represent that with multi-frequency depth grids, with a structure inventory that has asset values, occupancy types, so that we know what damage functions to pull, and then we would and values obviously, and then we would integrate those across the damage frequency curve. So one thing that we need to be able to do this is multi-frequency depth grids across the domain that we're looking at. Ideally, we want to be able to draw the shape of the hazard frequency curve, which usually is nonlinear. So we would want to represent it with enough points to be able to capture that nonlinearity. About 8 frequencies typically does that work, you know, something like the 5, 10, 20, 100, or maybe the 50, 100, 200, and 500 are kind of around the range that we typically look at. But we want to capture the shape of that hazard frequency curve. I say depth grids because for a given frequency across the floodplain, the depth of flooding is different. So we need to understand that at a local level. For assets, I'm recommending that we use the National Structure Inventory. The National Structure Inventory has been developed to support risk assessments like this. The first version of the NSI was used to support the core water management group, and that was for regulation of dams. They would basically only look whenever there's a significant event, not whenever there's insignificant events. And so the accuracy of the NSI didn't have to be super high. It was also adopted for use in the dam safety world, where you have very large flows of water. And so the accuracy of foundation heights isn't as important for that because the depths of water are so great. As we move into more planning studies, we need to be more and more accurate. So we've been improving the National Structure Inventory to support these more specific asset location, lower frequency or more frequent events to support planning functions like floodplain management. The National Structure Inventory is a composite of data sets. So I was talking earlier about being in USA structures. And so those data sources are ingested into the National Structure Inventory, and we try to find the best of available data across that among other data sources. What we also are doing is we're incorporating a national scale parcel data set. The particular provider that we're using is Lightbox, which is a decent provider. It has some problems with data gaps that we had to fill. But again, as we try to build a national scale inventory, our we're going to operate at some level on averages. So not all structures are going to be perfect in their attribution. So I want to make sure that we're clear about that. If you want to see more about the process for building the National Structure Inventory, I've included the link below. I'll share these slides later. So the NSI, like I'm saying, is a base level data set. I would highly recommend that there is some level of curation prior to broad utilization. It's more likely to be accurate for a large aggregation. So something like a census block or a county would be better than thinking about it on a per asset level without curation. With curation, I think that if you do spend the time to make the data set better, I definitely think it could be utilized for individual asset decisions like structure raisins. To get to that higher level of specification, what I would encourage is utilization of some sort of survey tool. We have the National Structure Inventory Survey tool. Right now, it's behind the core firewall, so we would not be able to share that with our partners. If that's something that's desired for this project, we could talk about it. But what it does is it walks you through the process of doing something like a desktop survey. We tried to make it to where it was an application that could be utilized on say an iPad if somebody wanted to be remote when they're doing it. But for that to happen, we would have to be outside of the firewall for the state to use it. But this would collect information like verifying that the asset is in fact a structure, that you can view it in street view so that you can estimate first floor elevation or foundation heights. You can talk about things like the quality of the structure and its construction type, which would feed into information that would yield better application of the vulnerability of the structure to different hazards. So looking at street view, we can start to think about foundation heights. So as we gather these, each structure might be different in its foundation height, but effectively the same kind of structure. They're single family residentials. It looks like maybe one 2-story, one story, and one split level, or something along those lines. Maybe that other one's a 1-story. It's kind of hard for me to tell offhand, but we would be assigning a regional average and pulling off of that for those structures. So we might be wrong in the assessment of that, and we would want to know that. The way that you work through that is through something like the survey tool or doing a dashboard on your desktop to look through the street view to estimate, your foundation heights. To support improvement of the National Structure Inventory globally across the entire nation, I guess, we actually did perform national level surveys. So in 2020, we conducted 26,000 desktop surveys of structures to improve our understanding of the distribution of foundation heights across different regions and across different strata of the flood hazard. That allowed us to develop a better understanding of the distribution that we would apply when generating the National Structure Inventory, which would overall improve that base level data, but still wouldn't necessarily be as specific as a Kansas specific survey. So there's ability to improve it, but I would say that the NSI by itself also isn't a really bad data set. We've been improving it with time. The 2023 data set or 2024 data set should be released in the next couple of months. If we use that, then again, we'll get even further improvements across all attributes. If you want to talk about that, we can. So now we have a notion, we have these depth grids at frequency levels, we have these structures. We need to then bring those together with an understanding of the vulnerability or damage functions to combine those and integrate across the frequency curve. And for this particular project, we propose that we use the Go Consequences, which is an open consequences engine that is written in the language Go. It's designed to work in the cloud. It's designed to scale to very large scale. But what it does is it combines some sort of hazard, in our case flood, through the vehicle of a depth grid. So it combines some hazard with a consequences receptor, in our case, a structure inventory, so an asset. And we would combine those together to evaluate a consequences result, which in our case is an expected damage. And so that's what Go Consequences does. It has been used, it's been peer reviewed. So it's not just some random off the shelf thing or random thing from a dark corner of the interwebs. It's a tool that's been used in an article that was published in Nature Climate Change to conduct the national scale expected annual damage data set. So we utilize the Fathom data with the Go Consequences engine and the National Structure Inventory version 2019 to calculate loss of every structure across the nation and do some data analytics on that to understand the present and future flood risk by county, and wrote a paper about that to help people think bigger. It was kind of our goal. In addition to that scientific article, there's also the FEMA Future Flood Risk Data initiative that's going on. And for the base data that is being provided in Future Flood Risk Data, we are utilizing the National Structure Inventory with Go Consequences to publish our consequence results. Here you can see our pilot region 1, the Kanawha. Here is the losses across all of that study region. You can kind of zoom in, and here is a given depth grid. It's one event of the millions that we're running, but you can see the damages kind of within the depth grids that are being presented here. So that's what's happening on each event. All of those are getting aggregated to compute an expected annual damage. So running Go Consequences is pretty easy. What we do is we select the hazard source. In our case, it's going to be a series of frequency-based depth grids. We select a structure inventory source. My hope is that we use NSI 2024. Our fallback would be NSI 2020, 2022, which is what I'm using today and have been presenting in our images. And then we would select a depth damage source. I would recommend the Go Consequences default because that's compliant with USA's EGM guidance. And so that's kind of how this works. And the code looks something like this. Now, I'm not expecting everybody to be able to code. Ideally, what we would have is a service that could run on the cloud and compute this at scale. And then we compute damages for each AEP depth grid, and that would be a point on this table. So the 10-year damage, the 20-year damage, the 100-year damage, and the 1,000-year damage. I don't know. And then we would use Riemann integration, Riemann sums using trapezoidal rule to integrate under that curve to calculate some sort of loss like this. Let's see here. The next steps to be able to do something like this would be to gather depth damage or depth grids for our study area, review and modify any NSI inventories that you guys would like to do, and then host those inventories and depth grids in the cloud, and then run them with the selected damage functions you guys want to use. So that's the end of my slideshow. I was trying to rush, so sorry for going so fast, but I want to do one last thing, and I'll show you real quick. Here's Go Consequences. And so I'm going to clear console. This is, let's see, I shouldn't have done this before. Okay, here we go. Here are the depth grids for Humboldt County. So the 1 year, 2 year, 5 year, 10 year, 20 year, 50, 100, oh goodness, so many. The depth grids, we're using the NSI data to be able to compute this loss. And so I'm just going to run this test real quick in debug mode. So the very first thing that we'll do is we'll load all those depth grids, load links to all of those. And so then we'll compute off of them. The really interesting thing about Go Consequences is it doesn't actually load the depth grid into memory. This is how we achieve appropriate memory management. What happens is it loads a structure into memory, gets its geolocation, and then queries the depth grid. So there it goes, it's already done. So that took about 30 seconds to run Humboldt County for all of those expected annual damages. So the result should be right here. Here's the output. I can't view it in that, but I can view it in QGIS if you'd like me to. And then we only query the depth grids at the location. There's a new technology called a cloud optimized geotiff. If we publish our rasters in cloud optimized geotiff in the cloud, then actually we can compute without having to download the depth grids ever, which really improves performance in a lot of ways. And I can talk more about that, but I feel like my time's up, so I'm getting the goat hook. So I think it's time to end. I think one question that we need to answer is how are we going to host, or how are we going to transfer depth grids so that we can put them in the appropriate place for computation? And so I think that's the one conversation that Brian was wanting to have after this. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
So,
you guys have questions?
Yeah, Will, can you hear me okay? I wanted to ask you, Will, can you tell us if, you know, or can you explain how using this on a community basis is not as recommended as a watershed basis?
Yeah, so the NSI attribution is really what we're talking about there, in my opinion. So we use that assumption about foundation height when we're applying it, and we have a wide range of foundation heights that might be for single family residentials with slab on grade. It could be anywhere from 6 inches to, I don't know, a foot. And so that might be a tight range, but if you're a pier-based foundation, that range might be between 1 foot and, let's say, 7 feet. So the accuracy of what our damage, our loss estimate would be is going to be dependent upon that foundation height. Because we would be sampling from the depth grid how deep the water is above the ground. But if our foundation height is wrong, then we'll be pulling the wrong percentage loss off of our structures for those structures that have bad foundation heights. So thinking about it at the watershed level, those errors are going to balance. But thinking at it at the individual asset level, we could be very wrong on any given asset. And so that's why if you want to use it for individual decisions about individual structures, I would recommend a curation step, that you go through and you curate the inventory in the areas that you're interested about, not necessarily the entire inventory, but maybe everything within the 500-year floodplain in densely populated areas. And then ensure that your attribution is good before we run this. If it's not good, then update the attributes. If you're doing watershed analysis and you're just trying to say, gee whiz, we have opportunity for 3 studies next year, where should we probably invest? And I want to look at the entire state. Using this to aggregate your data to something like the counties to say, oh, I'm going to screen out these counties. They really don't have very much loss. And I'm going to focus on these 3 counties. It would be appropriate to do that without much curation. So that's really kind of, it depends on your use case for how you want to leverage this data on steps I would recommend for curation of the inventory.
In other words, that sort of watershed level aggregation becomes useful for prioritizing the different watersheds and focusing on consequence areas that need mitigation actions. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask him? Your microphone might be doing something again. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording though, because I think we got to where we need to be, but we can continue talking about these questions, and let's figure out if Tara wants to try again or type in maybe in the chat. But I'll end the recording, so thank you, Will.